for a bunch of years and eventually earned his PhD in philosophy in 1921. He'd kind of, academically, he was not brilliant, but he also, he had a lot of time. He wasn't really a popular kid, so he spent a lot of time, studying and whatnot. So he completed his PhD in philosophy in 1921. Now, at this point, despite his upbringing, his parents were Roman Catholics, very much keen on all of this stuff. But by this point in his life, he's finished his PhD in philosophy. He's kind of completely rejected these hearings. He's not into the church or religion or anything like that. He also had despite being a rather middling academic, he did have a very high opinion of himself. He thought that one day he was going to be this great philosopher. Indeed, he kind of already thought he was already a great philosopher and had this very big ego about it all. But the reality is other people are going to judge that, and basically no one else agreed that he was really a good philosopher at all. Now, at this time in Germany, anti-Semitism was definitely a thing. Anti-Semitism in Europe at this time was definitely a thing, and even compared to other, just regular level anti-Semites, Goebbels was, he was on a different level of anti-Semitism. Many of his opinions, indeed, were so hateful that he'd try and get them published. Yes, he's an academic, he's got a PhD, well, he's going to be publishing stuff or hoping to get published stuff, but basically the reality was his writings were just so hateful that they were just rejected for publication. And it's kind of, he really just didn't like the Jews. You see that becoming a common theme today. Anyway, kind of classic Goebbels. His pronunciation is weird. I'm definitely going to screw it up. It's spelt Goebbels, but it's Goebbels. I know that's not the German pronunciation, but it's the accepted English language pronunciation, Goebbels. Anyway, classic Goebbels. He's basically has a very high opinion of all his works. He's like, this is brilliant anti-Semitism, or whatever. And he's like, if no one is going to publish it, I'll just publish it myself. I'll put it out. It's amazing. People will read it. I'll be lauded as this academic genius. Unsurprisingly, he wasn't. Nobody reads it. And at this point in his life, he's this kind of sickly dude. He's a failed writer. He's an unnotable philosopher. He's making a bit of money tutoring. That's kind of it. He's kind of a bit of a failure. And you feel, oh, okay, let's combine being an outcast, being a bit of a failure, with a bit of extremism, and you're going to go find a nice extremist club to be a part of, and that club, as you might have guessed, was the Nazi Party. 1924, Joseph Goebbels joins the Nazi Party, and this is where today's story kind of really cracks off. So, Let's understand the Nazi Party at the time. Let's understand what exactly was going on in Germany at the time. Now, Germany was financially in the toilet. World War I was disastrous for Germany. The sanctions afterwards were disastrous. You know this story. World War I screwed up. This is the interesting thing. I was reading a piece, this was a while ago, but I don't remember, saying like the most important assassinations. And it was the thing, arguably that kicked off World War I, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and how that didn't just lead to the First World War, but it ultimately led to the Second World War because of the sanctions on Germany after the First World War. Not 100% sure, were the sanctions really that terrible? All of this is debated, but it was an interesting bit of speculation nonetheless. Anyway, relevant for our story today is that Germany's economy is in the toilets. I remember reading books. It's interesting. I don't think we ever specifically studied the Second World War at school, or I didn't at least, but we studied the period in between the wars about, hyperinflation in Germany and all of this stuff. One of the images that really stuck out to me from a textbook when I must have been, 14 or 15 years old, was a picture of a woman, a black and white picture of a woman. She's got a wheelbarrow and it's full up with piles of cash, just bundles and bundles of money, and she's using it to exchange it for bread, just a loaf of bread. So I felt that was really nicely illustrative of Germany's financial situation at the time. And this is why the Nazis were popular. People wanted something different. They wanted anything different. They were like, this isn't working. What can we change? And you see this often in history. People will go for extremist parties when there's an enormous amount of dissatisfaction. And those extremist parties, they're really good at kind of riling up the people, blaming someone else, and getting popular that way. So what was good for Goebbels about this is basically, like we said, no one's really reading his writing. It's very extreme. No one's publishing it. When he self-publishes it, no one reads it. Not really surprising. But when he joins the Nazi Party, suddenly he's kind of got this built-in audience. These people, they're hateful, and they want to read his hateful spiels. So he's putting it all out. Yay, it's very good. And also, this gets him recognized within the party as someone who, hey, you know, there's something to this. This would be, you know, a good fit for the propaganda for the party. So he starts becoming the propaganda guy who does the Nazi Party stuff. It's a pretty wonderful fit. It's what he's doing already. And indeed, this stuff works really well. And this kind of fake news, this propaganda, it ultimately helps Hitler get elected Chancellor of Germany in 1933. Now, as Hitler rises to power, he eventually installs himself as Führer, and at this point, Hitler can appoint Goebbels as Minister of Propaganda. It's official. He's no longer just this guy writing this hate speech that turned into kind of a propaganda author for a potential a non-in-power political party, and now he is the Minister of Propaganda for Nazi Germany. So it is certainly a pretty enormous jump there. And this kind of led Goebbels to have an enormously high opinion of Hitler. He's the one who got him in this position, who took him from being this kind of loser dude to being at this level. Hitler was his savior, and you'll see how loyal to Hitler Goebbels is as we go through this episode. Now, as well as writing new stuff, as well as writing new propaganda, Hitler also gave Goebbels the task of censoring media that would conflict with Nazi ideals, and this led to the famous book burnings. So they'd burn books by certain authors, you know, the socialist philosophy of Karl Marx, these kind of things that directly disagreed with the Nazi thoughts at the time, and you know, just so people don't have an opinion on Nazism. Pretty smart play. Now, the weird thing is that Goebbels was also burning a lot of books and ordering them not to be sold and suppressing them of kind of stuff that didn't really just seem to be in, you know, is this really against the Nazi ideal? It just seems this is a bit random. And people speculate that this was just people he was jealous of. He's like, oh yeah, you're better than me. You're actually successful. I'm a failed writer. So yeah, let's just burn your books. Abuse of power started early for Goebbels. And this was kind of jumping up to this position of Minister of Propaganda real suddenly. Hitler's kind of right there in the inner circle. It gave him this taste of control, and this was something he absolutely loved. There's another thing. I was just talking about that John Wayne Gacy one we did earlier, and when he went to work in that KFC or whatever, he's like, why do you want to work there? I love controlling people. It seems like that's a trend. So there we go. So Goebbels realizes, at the time, it's obvious today, of course, but back in the day, this was a relatively new media. So he realized that a great way to incite emotions in people wasn't just writing things. It wasn't just writing these semi-academic articles that no one in an actual legitimate academic circle would publish, but he realized the movies are the way to go. So the largest film studio in Berlin, it was called the Universum Film Aktiengesellschaft. Let's just call that the UFA for short. Now, the UFA, it was well respected throughout the world. They'd produced silent films, one I've actually heard of. Like, I've never seen it. I'm not an expert on old movies, but there's a movie called Metropolis, which was made in 1927. I think if you looked up the poster for Metropolis, you'll probably recognize it. It's this, if I'm remembering correctly, it's this Art Deco poster. It's pretty cool. And this was a beautiful silent film. Huge UFA was very famous for all of this stuff. And so one of Goebbels' first orders of business is to forcibly take over the studio on behalf of the Nazi government. You know, just a bit of a government takeover. Very dictatorial moves right there. Also, worth noting, Goebbels and Hitler, they're these huge movie buffs. So they really enjoy American movies and movies from all over the world. But they don't want regular German people seeing these because they're sending the wrong message. They just want them to receive the Nazi message. So they ban American movies, but of course they have them all in their private film vaults and they can watch them all they want. Yeah, again, nice hallmark of a dictatorship there, where it's, you know, you have so much more than anyone else. Now, Goebbels basically set out to make sure that the German film industry was incredibly loyal to Hitler. Obviously, he had done the takeover of the UFA, but you got your actors, they're independent people, all of this stuff, blah, blah, blah. You know, you've got to, he wanted to bring them all into lines. He wanted them all to hate the Jews as well. So basically, he said, no Jews, and you've got to cut all the Jews out of your lives if you want to work. If you don't do that, we're going to essentially blacklist you and you will never work again. Also, actors who don't obey me, you can't leave Germany. Apparently that was just to make them more miserable. So you've got people who were successful actors, if they stuck by their principles and were like, I'm not going to abandon my Jewish friends because of your crazy ideals, they were blacklisted, they'd never work again. And indeed, several of these people, they killed themselves rather than not work in Nazi Germany or live in Nazi Germany, unable to work, unable to leave. They chose suicide instead. Now, actresses throughout Europe who auditioned for prestigious roles at this studio, you know, this was a big deal still. They were really walking into a trap. Many of them had walked into a trap already. It's just got the bad end of the situation here because they'd signed a multi-year contract. UFA hadn't become a new entity, it had just become a Nazi-owned studio, so they still had these multi-year contracts with the studio to produce multiple movies, so now they're having to make these Nazi movies. Obviously, they don't have to do them, but then they'll be blacklisted and all of this. You can understand why people don't want to do this. That's got to be a really tough decision. And yeah, being a Jewish sympathizer or not doing this, and especially being someone who's notable, that doesn't look good for propaganda. Your life is going to be miserable, or your life's going to be great. It's morally confusing, morally complicated there. Anyway, Goebbels, he basically decides that the best role for the studio to take is, as we can't show these American movies are not being shown in Germany, what we're going to do is we're going to make our own Nazi versions of these American movies. I wrote here, they take the American movies and they just throw some extra Nazi-ness in. So, and that is essentially what they were doing. You know, now some of these were really clearly just Nazi propaganda. There was one about the Hitler Youth, about how the Hitler Youth are all amazing and blah, 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 blah. And these are fine, but when you see something like this, you know it's propaganda. Like, if you've seen those North Korean, how great we are, the subtitled ones, you can find them on YouTube or whatever, and it's just clearly propaganda. But the more subtle ones are the really intelligent ways to persuade people of your ideals. So, looking at an example here, there was a 1941 movie called, in English, Accuse. And basically, the whole idea of this movie was to get the German population to agree with the Aktien T4 program. And this was a program which basically pushed for the euthanization of disabled and terminally ill people in Germany. So this is something that you'd look at and, you know, a proposed idea, let's euthanize disabled people, as this, just know that's morally reprehensible. And the way the way the Nazis work to subtly change people's minds. Sorry, the movie's not called Accuse, it's called I Accuse. And the way it works is, it's about a doctor who's at the peak of her career, and he gets married to this beautiful young woman, only to find out that she's been diagnosed with MS. Now, unlike today, MS treatment back then, it wasn't very good. There's also no cure for the disease. So this basically meant that this doctor's young wife, was dying of this incurable disease. And it's very slow, it's very painful, it's just not a good time. And she's begging her doctor husband to give her a lethal injection, which would put her out of her misery. And he struggles with this decision, legally, morally, but ultimately he does decide to assist in her suicide. And basically, the movie takes place largely in a courtroom. And you can see how clever this is, and you can see how this would really work. And people left that movie basically convinced that assisted suicide was there to help their friends and family members who were suffering. And it's not that far of a leap to go from there. It's a giant leap, but you're pushing people along the path to, coming to terms, accepting, or just not fighting against something like the T4 program. So, yeah, that was ultimately passed, and with that, probably another part of history you're familiar with. Definitely something that's been portrayed in movies, and just a well-known part of Nazi Germany was innocent people taken from their homes and they're killed, all in the pursuit of the perfect master race, which the way biology works. I'm not sure if MS is a genetic. I mean, it's a genetic disease, but is it a hereditary disease? I don't know. I always thought that was strange. The Germans killing. They were like, if we kill all the gay people, there won't be gay people. I was like, no, it's not hereditary, is it? That would be impossible. The bizarre ideas of Nazis. Anyway, let's talk a bit about Goebbels' social life. So, as well as giving him a career, as well as making him the minister, it also made him it also got him a wife. At 34 years old, he married a fellow Nazi named Magda. It was 1931. Now, this is an interesting thing. Hitler was the best man at their wedding. Remember, he's his savior. And now in the public eye, they seem to have this perfect marriage. Everything's going wonderfully. We'll see how that goes later on. Fun little aside here. I looked up photos of this wedding, and it's weird seeing Hitler in the background. You see Magda and Goebbels, Joseph and Magda Goebbels, they're walking down the aisle, they're doing all these things, and Hitler's just there standing in the background. It's just weird to see Hitler in the background, because obviously normally when you see pictures of Hitler, he's front and center. Now, they go on, they have several children together, they live in this huge gated compound in the woods outside of Berlin, but not everything was really as simple as that. It wasn't this perfect Aryan German marriage. Goebbels had a bit of a reputation for objectifying women, and he was surrounded by beautiful actresses all day, and he basically took advantage of his position, Weinstein style. So, according to the testimony of a woman called Anneliese Erlig, she was given the starring role in one of the movies that he made at this UFA studio. Basically, Goebbels asks, hey, you want to go for a drive and talk about the movie? And then he drives her back to his compound, and let's just say nothing good happens at a Nazi compound. He offers her a drink, he begins to force himself on her. Shocker, I know. She starts kicking, she starts screaming, she gets free from him, and he basically says, if you don't meet my demands, I'll make sure that you never work in the movies again. Timely, given what's going on in Hollywood these days. She decided to take her chances. She wasn't going to do that just to secure her career, and so she does show up for work the next day. But basically, there's an announcement. The film has been cancelled, and Erlig was blacklisted from ever working in Germany again. So she became one of the people who, basically had their careers destroyed by Nazi Germany. So, now this, probably not a big surprise to say that this is not something that happened on a one-time basis. Goebbels did this regularly, but he did actually eventually fall in love with a woman called Lida Barova. And she was actually one of the few actresses who was a genuinely faithful Nazi. She even turned down opportunities to go to Hollywood in favor of moving to Germany. Now, she moved from Prague to Berlin in 1935, and she married an actor named Gustav Frohlich, who had divorced his Jewish wife in order to continue his successful acting career. Now, according to Barova, she felt pressured into being in a relationship with Joseph Goebbels because, she had heard all these stories about him ruining other actors' careers, and she kind of knew that if she said no to him, then there's a chance that both her and her husband, they're never going to be able to work again. They're going to be added to that blacklist. Now, she must have been a very good actress because because Goebbels became convinced that he should leave his wife and they should run away together. And Goebbels, he tells his wife, he says, Magda, I'm having this affair with this woman, I want a divorce. And rather than Magda just, instead of doing whatever people do in that situation, she just goes straight at Adolf Hitler and says that this Barova woman is seducing him and trying to tear the marriage apart. Goebbels says to Hitler, please, I really want a divorce. I'm in love with this Barova woman. I want to run away with her to Japan. Yup, true story. He wanted to give up his position of power, give up everything, and just move to Japan and be with Barova. So, Hitler basically says, no, that ain't happening. The Nazi Party needs you. One, you're supposed to be portraying this perfect Aryan marriage. Stay with your damn wife. And no, you are not going to Japan. So, this didn't go well. The two men get into a big fight. There's a screaming match. Dozens of people end up hearing this thing. However, Hitler does acquiesce somewhat, and he says, yo, Goebbels, if you're still not happy in your marriage in a few months, you can get divorced. At the same time, he also says, Barova, get the hell out of here. You're going back to Prague. And this is a big turning point in Goebbels' life. His love has been sent away back to Prague. His wife has, his marriage is now, well, you can imagine it's not going to be super easy after that happens. And also, Hitler is not his biggest fan anymore. So, oh, and also, this kind of spilled out to the rest of the Nazi party. They're like, oh, he's weak. He's weak. And here's where it gets a bit dark, because Goebbels saw himself as, I need to redeem myself in the eyes of Hitler. I really need to do something that will bring me back into the Führer's good graces. And so in 1939, he's the Minister of Propaganda. He publishes a fake news story in a newspaper that says, like, a German man was was shot and killed by a Jewish man in Paris. Goebbels went on to speak in the streets, claiming that the Jews were trying to destroy their society and Europe's society, and he riled up a mob, and they went around and they burned down a synagogue. Not only that, but he continued this extra push of hate, and he traveled to Poland to film with a documentary film crew to film a documentary, air quotes, inside of a Jewish ghetto. Now, the people showed in the movie and the documentary, they had sunken faces, they wore rags, they were dirty, they were sick, and Goebbels basically said, yeah, it's because they choose to live like this. History has told us that, oh no, it's because the Nazis were forcing them to live in subhuman conditions. Big surprise, people don't like living like animals. Anyway, Goebbels saw this as an opportunity to compare them to animals, to say that, they choose to live this way, they're less than human, we have to exterminate them. This film, it was called The Eternal Jew, and it premiered in 1940. And basically, the movie had this message that the Jews are dirty criminals, but also it had and they live in these horrible conditions, but he also had the message that if we lose the war, the Jews are going to take over the world, which kind of seems like a bit of a mixed message, because he's kind of saying that they're animals, but also if we don't stop them, they're going to be able to take over the world. Anyway, he said, humanity would sink into eternal darkness. It would fall into a dull and primitive state were the Jews to win this war. They are the incarnation of that destructive force that in these terrible years has guided the enemy war leadership in a fight against all that we see as noble, beautiful, and worth keeping. For that reason alone, the Jews hate us. They despise our culture and learning, which they perceive as towering over their nomadic worldview. They fear our economic and social standards, which leave no room for their parasitic drives. So, like I've said a few times, Goebbels was good at this propaganda stuff, and the German people believed the message. And essentially, they felt that because of this propaganda, that the concentration camps, they were justified. Goebbels would later visit Auschwitz, and he'd see the death and the torture there. And in his private journal, he wrote, "It may be barbaric, but they truly deserve it." So, kind of believing his own lies there. Pretty crazy stuff. People get super deluded. It's interesting. Now, the good news is that for Goebbels is that now Hitler was cool with him again. All it had cost was just millions of lives, though. So, indeed, Hitler's trust in Goebbels it had grown to a significant degree now, and he would actually say, Goebbels, you can go do some of my public appearances, you can, he was the one that actually announced that Germany was now at war with the Russians. So he made another propaganda film, this time saying the Russians were bad. He basically said they're all controlled by the Jews, and therefore we have to go to war with the Russians. After that film, he stood in front of a crowd of thousands of people at a sports stadium in Berlin and just said there needs to be total war. And he was met with thunderous applause. Now, as you might already know, don't invade Russia. Don't invade Russia in the winter. And this was essentially a large part of what led to the Nazi Germany's downfall. The Germans couldn't handle the harsh winters. And then also you got the United States joining the Allies and Italy switching over to the Allies. And suddenly Germany's stronghold in World War II, it's starting to tumble like dominoes. Now, you probably can tell already so far that Goebbels is a little bit crazy. After the invasion of the Soviet Union, though, his mental state, it just seems to become more and more unraveled. According to Wilfried von Owen, a man who works on Goebbels' staff, there was basically this meeting where a bomb dropped in the garden of Goebbels' house. The glass windows, they all broke. Everyone in the room who's in that meeting just ducks for cover, and Goebbels just stands there. He doesn't even flinch. He just brushes the broken glass off his notes, and he continues reading the speech that he was giving as if nothing happens. Credit where credit's due here. That's fairly badass. Like, cool guys don't look at explosions. Goebbels doesn't even flinch while a bomb is blasting in the windows of his house. Yeah, it seems a little bit crazy. It's got to be a weird sight. But it seems inside, though, he was composed. On the outside, he was composed, but on the inside, it seemed to be quite a bit of panic. And at the end of the war, Hitler says to Goebbels, we're going to lose. That's it. I'm going to go to my bunker and off myself and my family. You're now Chancellor of Germany, Goebbels. This is the perfect time for it. And he basically said, hey, once the Allies invade, I want you to run Germany. Goebbels, though, he was so devoted that he simply refused to live without Hitler. He told his wife and all of his children to make themselves clean, put on their Sunday best, and go to the Führer's bunker. And yeah, we know what happens next. Hitler committed suicide, leaving Goebbels as Germany's new chancellor. It wasn't a position he would hold for very long, as next day, Goebbels and Magda, they poisoned their 6 children and then killed themselves. And that was the end of Goebbels. That's where the story ends today. Nasty, failed man, successful at propaganda. Ultimately, it didn't work out, though. So, yeah, it didn't work out, and he had to kill himself and, horribly, his children. So, that's Goebbels. This was a depressing episode. Leave us a review. Let me know how I'm doing. Head on over to iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Say hi. Drop me an email, simon@biographics.org, if you want to. Say hey that way. I want to know, how am I doing? Which, if we've got a biographics episode from the past that you particularly liked on our YouTube channel, then check out our YouTube channel. We got much more of these. Go do that, let me know, and yeah, all of that good stuff. Tell a friend. Why not? And as always, thank you for listening. Hey, welcome to another episode of the Biographics podcast. Thank you to everyone who is listening to this so far. It's nice to see those numbers ticking up in the podcast interface where they count your downloads. It's not really analytics because you don't really get that information with the podcast, but I appreciate everyone tuning in. Thank you to people leaving reviews as well. That is always appreciated. Go over and do that on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts, and yeah, let me know how I'm doing. That would be great. Today in the video, we're doing someone whose video on the YouTube channel did really well. Anything about this guy on YouTube seems to be doing well. If you're listening to this and you're a YouTuber and you think, oh, I wonder what subject would do well on YouTube, do anything about Rasputin. I think we titled the video The Devil Incarnate, and yeah, people like that kind of darker stuff. This, I'm pretty sure, I'm not going to check right now, but I would say this has it's going to be like 80% chance of being demonetized, so we don't make any money off it. Nor on this podcast either. No sponsors on this thing, so that is what it is, I suppose. Anyway, let's crack on with it, and let's talk a bit about Rasputin. So he was, he's most definitely dead. Spoiler alert. He was a Russian peasant who claimed to have mystic healing powers. That's kind of the very broad strokes overview of Rasputin. Fun thing is, if you Google Grigory Rasputin, you can Google people, and on the right, Google has that, bit of information about people. So for me, because they've confused me with another Simon Whistler who happens to come from the exact same part of the UK as me, they've confused me with this author. So it says Simon Whistler, author, and then died in 2005. Which is obviously not the case. But when you Google Rasputin, it comes up as his instead of saying author or businessman or politician or whatever it is, it says Russian peasant, which I like, because, and you're going to see why I like this if you don't already know anything about Rasputin, because he's kind of a bad dude. Anyway, he didn't just say that he had healing powers. He basically claimed that he was the second coming of Christ. He went on to form his own cult, and he even ended up ultimately manipulating members of the Romanov family basically into believing that he was this holy man. His infiltration of Russian society and how far he rose is incredible. Serious infiltration. Anyway, Once he had everyone wrapped around his figure, he used all this influence, he used this infiltration in order to essentially just influence the Russian government, and ultimately that influence sort of led to the downfall of the Romanov dynasty. So that was pretty serious. This guy is a pretty serious place in history. Anyway, he was also a bit mental. He was also a bit crazy, definitely. For years he claimed that he struggled between the forces of good and evil within him. Many priests at the time, they didn't believe that his powers came from God. They actually believed, rather than being the second coming, as he claims, that he was actually the Antichrist. But this isn't the craziest thing of all. What I really feel is the craziest thing of all is that he actually managed to get people to follow him. If you Google a picture of Rasputin, or if you bring up a picture of Rasputin in your mind, he looks crazy. He's got these crazy eyes, and then also imagine that dude, except he really stank. He really, really smelled bad. We'll get into all of that later, find out why he was quite so smelly. Despite going to bathhouses a lot, he still stank. There's a good reason for that. But as we always do, let's go right back to the start. We're going to take it back to 1869 to the Siberian village of Pokrovskoy. Perhaps that's the pronunciation. January the 20th, 1869 is when Rasputin is born. Just let me give you a heads up, there's going to be a lot of Russian pronunciations in here. Rather than disrupt the flow of the podcast, look up the correct pronunciations like I do on a video. I'm just going to roll with it. I probably remember some of them from the video. If I don't, you're just going to have to deal with it. It's okay. It doesn't spoil the story. If you're Russian, I apologize. If you're anywhere else, too bad. Alright, so Siberia at the time is kind of the dumping ground for Russia's criminals. It was where people were sent into exile. They had prison colonies that were full of men doing hard labor. See, unlike, colonial Britain or whatever, Russia's so large, you don't have to go to other countries to find places to send your prisoners. You just send them to the other side of your enormous, enormous country. I kind of knew Siberia was cold and miserable because of a James Bond computer game from... It must have been the 90s. I think it was on PlayStation 1, maybe PlayStation 2. I was playing it when I was a kid, and basically you're sneaking around this Russian base somewhere in Russia, obviously, and if you get captured by the bad guys, you end up on a train, and the guard or whatever in the cutscene says, "You think it's cold here? Wait until you get to Siberia." And I'm like, oh yeah, okay, so Siberia is not a good place to be. If anyone knows what that James Bond game is, hit me up on Twitter at Simon Whistler. I'd love to play that game again. I remember it being an awful amount of fun. Anyway, so here in Siberia, there's a lot of people who've been exiled for their religious beliefs, their political beliefs, this kind of thing. It was definitely one of the harshest places to live in all of Russia, perhaps even all of the world. Anyway, let's look at his family life, at Rasputin's background. So his father was a farmer, a peasant farmer, and a courier, and his mother was busy giving birth to 7 children. Rasputin was the 8th. Now, this is the late 19th century, and children were dying in childbirth quite often then. But even back then, all of these children died. Rasputin was the only one who actually survived the harsh Siberian winter and made it. And God, hearing about that, your first 7 children dying, just keeping at it is, God, just a reminder that today, despite what the news seems to imply and how you talk to people, it's like the world's going to shit and everything, is wow, just now compared to 100 years ago. No, we didn't even have antibiotics like 100 years ago. I think it's almost 100 years ago. It's a glorious time to be alive. Anyway, as a boy, he claims that he would have visions of the future and that angels were appearing to him in his dreams. Now, there was kind of... He wasn't just, talking about this. He also did things to kind of make people believe that he was true. It's said that he knew things about his neighbors that he couldn't possibly know. Obviously, you're gonna have to forgive my skepticism in this episode. I'm fairly skeptical, and especially when it comes to mysticism and like angels coming to him in dreams and telling people about his neighbor's secrets. I'm just gonna go ahead and assume that he actually found a way to find out this information that didn't have anything to do with angels coming to him in his sleep. Anyway, It's not really important. The important thing is that some villagers did believe him. Many villagers believed him. And they believed that he was the second coming of Christ and that he was touched by God and all of this stuff. And I'm sure there were some skeptical people, but on the other side, it wasn't necessarily the skeptics. It was the people who were like, he's a demon and he's working with the devil. Anyway, he also got into a lot of trouble when he was a kid, so he was generally quite badly behaved, so people tended to kind of go down on the side of him being the devil rather than him being the second coming. Anyway, 28 years old, his childhood kind of goes past, there's nothing super noticeable. 28 years old, and he gets married and has 4 children with his wife, who he met in a neighboring village. Now, he had a reputation for being an abusive alcoholic. He's also known for cheating on his wife, so yeah, second coming, I mean, sounds a lot like Jesus. Not really, that's sarcasm. Anyway, one day he steals a horse, and then word gets out that he's a horse thief. And this is something I actually made a note here that I want to look up in the future. Maybe I'll mention it on a future pod as a bit of follow-up. But horse theft was this really serious crime at some point. It's, I guess, because it was people's main form of transportation or something. But weren't people like hanged for stealing horses and all of this stuff? And I feel if someone stole my car, which I guess would be the modern equivalent, I'd be angry, and I'd make an insurance claim. I'd tell the police would do nothing. I'd never see my car again, most likely, or it would be trashed or whatever. I don't expect that criminal to be hanged. I wouldn't want them to be hanged. I'd just be like, hey, you should get in trouble for stealing my car, but yeah, hopefully, I don't know, maybe a bit of prison time, maybe not, maybe community service. I don't know what the punishment is for stealing a car. It's not something I've ever looked into. But yeah, so hanging people. Anyway, this was a serious crime. Rasputin is a horse thief, but instead of facing the consequences, he basically gallops off towards a local monastery and says, "Hey, can I have sanctuary here, please? I'm bad. I'm a horse thief. But please save me from my fate." And so he ends up staying in this monastery with the Christian brothers for several months. And basically they convince him to be a good person, to change your evil ways, come to the light of a God. And it's at this time, there's a man in the church called Makari, and he becomes his mentor, and it's at this point that basically he abandons his family, so he comes to the light of God, he becomes incredibly religious and all of this stuff, and then he uses it as an excuse to abandon his family because he wants to travel around and evangelize to various villages. Sounds like super morally upstanding right there. I mean, didn't he have 4 kids and a wife? What the hell, Rasputin? Anyway, now is the time where we first kind of bump into cultiness. Is cultiness a word? But we're bumping into cults in our story, but it's not his own cult. Now, many historians believe that he's out in Siberia, he's going around to these different villages, he's spending a lot of time going through the forests of Siberia, and in these forests there is a cult called the Plisties, and basically they're an offshoot of the Russian Orthodox Church, and many of their members, they would go to normal mass on Sunday and do all the kind of Russian Orthodoxy things, and then they would also go and have secret meetings in the forest, and you know, there's lots of them in there, and Rasputin would have been bumped into them at some point. Anyway, these Plisties, they believed that salvation could only be achieved through the purging of sin, which doesn't sound so crazy. It's like religious stuff, you know, purge your sin, get rid of your sin, forgive the sins, or you know, whatever. Anyway, well, they would perform these ceremonies where they would choke one another and then let go at just the last moment, and they would get high on the asphyxiation. They also did, you know, crazy things like they speak in tongues, and then they spin around and dance until they feel drunk, and then they'd kind of just fall to the ground, get in a frenzy, all of this stuff. But then they would also let out their pent-up desires by having sex with whoever was laying next to them in massive orgies. It kind of sounds like definitely the setting in Siberian forests. It's all a bit weird. It's 100 years ago. It sounds kind of like a horror movie or something. Anyway, Rasputin, he continues to travel and evangelize the Christian faith, but this isn't your, when Rasputin comes to visit, this isn't your normal visit, run-of-the-mill visit where someone comes to a Bible in the drawer and says, can I tell you about the good word? Oh no, these monk wanderers, they were forbidden from bathing, so it's, can I tell you about the good word? Oh my god, you stink. I don't actually know the reason why they weren't allowed to bathe. Apparently, I would think that would terribly hurt the converting of people, because like, absolutely not. You are not coming into my house, you smelly bastard. Okay. Also, another thing that he would do is he'd shackle himself in order to feel pain, to pay for his sins. It's the kind of classic extreme religion stuff. Anyway, at some point he decides to go home. He's got, like I said, he's got those 4 kids, and he's got that wife to abuse. So he goes home. He was completely changed, though. He wasn't, he still seems kind of like a bad dude. I don't think he ever really became a good guy. He changes to Christianity, but then he kind of immediately does stuff that seems pretty counter to a lot of the tenets of that religion. But he has kind of changed in some ways. His eyes stare on with this frightening intensity, and if you look at pictures of Rasputin, he's got these crazy eyes. Like crazy eyes. It's described, I wrote in my notes here, described as frightening intensity. And he also said that his visions from God are stronger than ever. Anyway, even though he just gets home, he sees his kids and all of this stuff, and he pretty much says to his wife, hey, listen, I'm now part of this, like, weird religious cult thing, and I need to use the basement as a meeting place for this religious cult. And what I'm going to do down there is have massive orgies with all my clisty friends. So, yeah, great husband there, Rasputin. Really solid stuff. Anyway, Rasputin, he one day claims that the Virgin Mary appeared to him and told him that he had to go to St. Petersburg, which, if you don't know, is all the way on the other side of Russia. It's really far. Remember, they were sending the criminals and the dissidents and whatever to Siberia, so St. Petersburg is all the way on the other side. Basically, it's kind of a crazy thing. The Virgin Mary said he had to go and help the royal family in St. Petersburg, but this is sort of a very crazy concept, because the royal family, they probably don't need help from a crazy man who's a peasant in Siberia. It is geographically, politically, financially incredibly far away from where they are. Anyway, so the question becomes now, well, we do know that he got into the royal palace, and we do know that he reached these higher echelons of Russian society, because that's why we're talking about him today, and that's what I said in the introduction. Now, basically, it all comes down to his mentor. Do you remember the mentor? I can't remember his name. It's the guy who he was in the church with him, and he's mentoring him, and he kind of takes him over to the religion and makes him a monk. Anyway, he was actually a former religious advisor of the Romanovs. So this guy manages to get Rasputin some noble clients, and Rasputin is a solid con man, or maybe he's actually mystical. Probably not. He's a good con man, and he amazes these noble clients with his mystical powers. And it actually got to the stage where rich people from St. Petersburg were willing to travel all the way over to his tiny village in Siberia to be healed by him. Indeed, the mentor monk then sends a letter of introduction for Rasputin to one of his friends in St. Petersburg, and with that letter of introduction being sent ahead, Rasputin then made his move. He took the incredibly long journey to St. Petersburg. Now, through his connections in the city, he met a couple of bishops. He met one bishop and a high-level priest. The bishop was a chap called Hermogen, and the priest was a chap called Trufanov, who apparently is better known as Iliador. Anyway, at first, they were shocked by Rasputin's disheveled appearance. Again, if you haven't seen a picture of Rasputin, go look one up, and then imagine he stinks terribly. Indeed, the two religious men, they noticed that he smelled terrible, and they found this kind of intense stare that he had truly terrifying. Anyway, one of the priests was a witness to his healing ability, and despite his disheveled appearance, despite his stinky bodily odors and stuff like that, he did think that he has been gifted by the power of God. So, yeah, he's got to be up to some pretty impressive, like, magic stuff. Anyway, now, Rasputin, as you might have guessed, he didn't really care what anyone thought of him. he'd meet with these dignified people. He'd come from this like peasant Russian village, and now he was circulating in all of these dignified circles, meeting all of these aristocratic people. And he was known. He'd pick his nose and eat it in front of these people. He'd mock the aristocrats openly in front of them. And it kind of made me want, is this kind of part of his appeal? There's something, there's something appealing about the guy, the girl, the whoever who just does not give a shit. And I think maybe this is kind of part of Rasputin's appeal. He just doesn't care what people think. I think the problem is, like, in theory, you think about it, it's like, oh, that's cool, because you see, movies or you read books where it's like, that guy doesn't give a shit, and it's awesome. But when they don't give a shit about their personal hygiene, it's maybe slightly more of an issue. Anyway, so he's kind of in these aristocratic circles, and he's slowly moving closer to these Romanov circles. He befriends a couple of princesses from Montenegro, Militia and Anastasia, and they were nicknamed the Crow Sisters because apparently they had crow-like noses. Anyway, they were not Russian, obviously, Montenegrin, and however, they were married to members of the Romanov family. Now, they were also involved in this kind of mysticism and the occult, and Rasputin was very much part of that, and they were also manipulative, and many people felt that they kind of manipulated their way into the Romanov royal family. Also, because of this, they were kind of treated as outcasts by the aristocracy. No one, really became super involved with them, but they were a good in for Rasputin. They were a good kind of to get into the Romanov circles because they were also outsiders, and they saw Rasputin, they took him a bit under their wing. Alright, so this just happened to be a matter of really excellent timing for Rasputin. So Tsarina Alexandra Romanov she'd just lost her spiritual advisor, Dr. Phil. Not really. That's kind of a bad joke. It was funnier when I wrote it down. His name is actually Dr. Philippe, but I like to imagine him. I was writing all these notes about this, and I kept imagining him as Dr. Phil. So that's what we're going to call him from now on. So she was really into Dr. Phil, and she believed that he had helped her somehow have a son after only having daughters. Again, not a brilliant understanding of science at the time, and a lot too much of a belief in mysticism. Anyway, this spiritual advisor, he's dying, he's on his deathbed, and he says to her, "You will meet another holy man very soon who is going to take my place." Again, feel like I gotta say, what an amazing prediction. You will find a new spiritual advisor after I am gone. Anyway, immediately after this, the Crow Sisters, they introduced Rasputin to the Tsar and the Tsarina at a party. It's well engineered. Indeed, the sisters had actually been the ones who had helped Tsarina Alexandra find Dr. Phil. So Alexandra, she basically learns of these stories of Rasputin's miraculous healing abilities, and she felt that she wanted him to help her sickly son, Alexei. So Alexei was born with a condition called hemophilia. Basically, it's a condition that stops blood from clotting. So, like, if you get a little cut on yourself and you don't force the bleeding to stop, your body won't do it for you, and you can have massive blood loss. So you've probably seen this in movies. Isn't the famous example like Jehovah's Witnesses who refuse medical treatment or something? They'll keep bleeding and then they'll die even though they could. There's something like, or hemophiliac Jehovah's Witnesses. I remember what it was. When I was studying law, the case example given was something about a Jehovah's Witness who was stabbed and then they refused medical intervention or something. They refused a blood transfusion. That's it. It's got nothing to do with hemophilia. I'm off on a tangent that isn't even useful, but I'll just close my thoughts on that because it would make sense. They got stabbed and then they refused a blood transfusion and they died, and the legal question was, is the person who stabbed them guilty of murder because they refused treatment? And the answer was yes, they are. It doesn't matter if you refuse treatment, you still stab them with the intention to kill them or cause them grievous bodily harm. It's been a long time since I studied that. That law could be out of date or just being remembered incorrectly. Let's get back to our story and stuff that's actually relevant to what's going on today. So basically, one day, Alexei falls down, he's got this hemophiliac disease, he cuts his knee and he won't stop bleeding. Now Rasputin shows up out of nowhere to the royal palace and he says, "I need to see the boy, I will heal him." He also said, "I had a vision from God, and without my help, your son, the prince, he's gonna die." I'm gonna say, like I've said throughout, my skepticism going to come in here? Probably not a vision from God. The reality is he most likely got this information about the boy scraping his knee and the bleeding not stopping from the Crow sisters, and then he showed up and just told people it was God. I mean, why wouldn't it be? Who else could it possibly be? Anyway, so he was allowed in. He went to see them. He told the doctors to get out, and he's going to use his healing powers on him. And miraculously, next he begins to heal, and this was enough, unsurprisingly, to convince Alexandra that he truly was this man who had these magical healing powers, and that he was going to be an amazing spiritual advisor. Now, don't worry, it wasn't magic. Modern-day scientists and historians have gone back, they've looked at this, and they've said, basically, he went in, he told the doctors to get out, and he took over the treatment, and he stopped the doctors from giving Alexei aspirin, which, as well as being a painkiller, is also a blood thinner, which would make someone who has hemophilia's condition even worse. So the blood would not be clotting at all, and it would keep flowing, and it would just be a worse situation than if no aspirin was given at all. So Rasputin takes him off it, and he seems to get a bit better. Anyway, this is an amazing case of good timing and the right people on the inside and all of that, because then, within just a few months, Rasputin is basically a regular installment in the Romanov family mansion. He sort of becomes the house drug dealer in a way. He gives drugs like opium, morphine, and cocaine to the Tsar, and he's basically, these are medicine. They're helping you with your various ailments. And people kind of did think this at the time, and, the Tsar, he probably didn't mind cocaine. It probably did make him feel quite good. He was like, oh, Rasputin, you must be a good god. Look at all these drugs you have for me. It's fantastic. Anyway, it wasn't just a kind of dealing with his ailments. They'd regularly get pretty high together. Not a surprise. What comes next? That would be addiction. And basically, this means Rasputin has to come past the palace any earlier. A lot more often. To basically feed his drug habit. Rasputin, the drug dealer. Now, on the other side of things, you got the Tsarina. She gets these migraine headaches, she suffers from anxiety, and basically Rasputin was able to take away her pain with all the wonderful drugs that he had and get her to relax. Now, soon enough, as you might imagine, the way you do to a drug dealer, they began to feel a bit of a dependency on him, and yeah, basically, Rasputin, he also started calling them Mama and Papa, which is a bit weird. He's got 4 kids, he's in his 30s. Is he older than... I'm not sure what age he is. He's definitely up there. It's weird. In my notes I write, remember folks, Rasputin is weird AF. Anyway, he begins to pray with the children at night to tell them bedtime stories. This understandably makes the nanny a little bit nervous. The oldest daughters are going through puberty, and she kind of thought there's some weird stuff might be going on with old Rasputin, the weirdo. Also, one of the maids claimed that Rasputin had raped her. As we will see, this is not far out of his wheelhouse. In fact, rape is definitely within his wheelhouse, as you will soon see. However, the Tsarina, she trusted Rasputin so much that she was like, you're lying, maid, he'd never rape anyone. And then he fired her. The nanny also tried to kick Rasputin out of the nursery. The children claimed that Rasputin was their friend and that the nanny was mean, so the nanny gets fired as well. Rasputin has the wool pulled so far over their eyes, it's actually crazy, but also solid parenting. Tsarina and Tsar, great job. Oh my, you let this smelly, crazy man into your house, and he becomes your drug dealer, and then he starts, being weird around the kids and raping the maid. Okie dokie. Anyway, newspapers around St. Petersburg, they begin to print stories about this incident, the prayers at the evening with the children, and they say that Rasputin was let into the princesses' beds, and, this is definitely weird. So anyway, despite his close relationship with the Romanov family, he didn't live with them. He actually had his own apartment in St. Petersburg, which was pretty handy for him because all of his various cult followers, they would come to his house and they would have parties together. And you might think, oh, these were like the parties that he was having in his basement in Siberia, and I mean, they sort of were, but also they would have potluck-style parties. So a bunch of women would show up, they'd have these hot dishes, and then they would eat this food. What they would also do, which is slightly more weird, is they'd all sit around a table. Rasputin would be at the head of the table, and he'd just be sitting there staring into space with his super intense and scary eyes, and then suddenly he'd just begin to mumble something. And when this happens, the women there, they'd desperately try and listen to it super carefully to try and hear what he was saying. They'd get pieces of paper, they'd write it down, thinking that whatever came out of his mind is just amazing. Another thing is that for some reason, they found this incredibly attractive. Who knows why? Rasputin definitely had something about him. And anyway, they were really into this, and they also believed, this was his thing, that he's the second coming of Christ, and and the way it was similar to his basement in Siberia was these women would often offer to have sex with him. There was one disciple in particular who was particularly faithful, had a ton of faith in him. She actually left her husband and children and lived in his apartment permanently. She also, anyone who came to the apartment, she'd be like, you have to address Rasputin as God. This is the thing, like, often I'm doing these biographies, and I really feel like the stories of some people's lives is truly just stranger than fiction, and this one definitely delivers. Anyway, one time he was having one of these parties, and he's in the bedroom with Olga, and one of the members at the party, one of the other women, opens the door, and apparently Olga is in there. She's holding Rasputin's penis and just screaming, "You are Christ, and I am yours." I'm assuming that was in Russian, and still, whoa. Anyway, all of this was a bit of a scandal, and it attracted a bit of police attention. Police would follow him and they'd see what he was up to. There were also various reports that he'd hire prostitutes on an almost daily business, and he'd bring them into the bathhouses. Now, you'd think this is where it's kind of, I mentioned at the beginning, he stank even though he went to bathhouses, and this is kind of what would happen. He'd go into the bathhouse with them, they'd go into a private room, they'd both get undressed, and then he would take off his leather belts and he'd beat the woman with it, and saying that, oh yeah, I'm beating the sin of lechery out of your soul. Remember, he's crazy. Anyway, he'd also have sex with her, not super surprising there, and all of this is particularly horrific. It's pretty horrible. But the more horrible thing is that he didn't even bathe. You're in a bathhouse, Rasputin. You stink. I know you've got this weird cult thing going on where it's like it's bad to bathe, but dude, come on, man. I bet you'd have more people into your cult if you occasionally washed. Anyway, one time he was witnessed leaving one of these bathhouses. He was holding his head and he was screaming at the demons inside of his head. He also claimed that he could see the devil and that there was this ongoing battle from good and evil over his soul. And, gotta remember, he's a little bit crazy, and he's also taking a lot of drugs. You remember all the drugs he was giving to the Tsar? Well, he's also into drugs himself. So, and now, do you remember our priestly friends? What was his name? Bishop Hermigan and the guy who wanted to be called Iliador? Well, they were the guys who introduced him into St. Petersburg society, and kind of him shouting, coming out of the bathhouse, yelling at demons, yelling about demons, saying that there's this battle for good and evil. Basically, this was damaging their reputation. It was not good for them. They introduced him to society, and now he was acting all crazy. There's one time, apparently, Hermigan grabs Rasputin by the penis and screams that he was thinking with it rather than with his brain. It must have been quite a scene. Anyway, the kind of assault didn't end there. They also had a giant wooden crucifix with them, which they used to beat him up. And, this seems good. Like, I felt like he kind of deserves this after beating all of the women in the bathhouses. I feel like getting beaten with a crucifix was probably something he deserved. However, the corrupt power of Christ did not compel him, and basically Rasputin goes off to the Tsarina, who, remember, they're very close. She kind of thinks he's this wizard god. And she's like, he's like to her, these guys beat me up with a cross, a giant crucifix, they tried to kill me. And the Tsarina, she's like, all right, you bishop dude, and Iliador, off you go. You're now in exile. And that's kind of the end of them. Anyway, at this time, Rasputin, he's not sent into exile, but he goes off to Siberia to visit his home village. Now, Iliador, they'd beaten him up with this crucifix. Whether they meant to kill him or not, we don't really know. But we do know that he was interested in killing Rasputin after this. Indeed, he confessed all of the details in a biography. He was basically convinced that Rasputin was the Antichrist, so he essentially didn't give up on trying to kill him. He hired a disfigured prostitute, and she was in his village back in Siberia. She had been abused by a former client. She'd cut off. She'd had her nose cut off, and she just had this hole in her face. All very horrible stuff. And he basically told her that Rasputin was abusing these sex workers. He was beating them. He was abusing women. He's a bad guy. Pretty damn truthful. And so this disfigured prostitute, she goes to Rasputin's village, and she's waiting outside of his house. Now, Rasputin, at some point, he receives a telegram, and he wants to go to the telegram office.